Wait. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Flash Fiction Z, bringing you the best in international flash fiction. I'm Francine Witte in the US, and my co-host, Meg Pokrass, is in the UK. Tonight, the Z in Flash Fiction Z is for New Zealand, because we are featuring three wonderful writers today who make their homes there, Ghosh, Sandra Arnold, and Michelle Elvy. We will hear from all three readers, and then we'll have a little discussion on the scene of flash fiction in New Zealand. So let me turn this over to Meg Pokrass, who will introduce our first reader. Meg.
Thank you so much, Francine. Hi, everyone. We're really excited to focus on New Zealand-based writers tonight. As flash fiction readers and writers around the world know, New Zealand has become a hot spot for innovative flash fiction writing. It's an honor to be hosting these three New Zealand-based authors tonight. And we'll be opening the reading with the amazing Ghosh. So I'm going to introduce Nod right now. Originally from the UK, Ghosh lives in Christchurch, New Zealand. Nod has two novella and flash published by Truth Serum Press, The Crazed Wind in 2018, and Filthy Sucre, 3 novellas in February 2020. Nod is currently seeking a publisher for a third novella in flash, Toy Train, from which today's readings come. Nod's website is www.nodghosh.com. Welcome, Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Meg and Francine. And I'm very honoured to be invited to read on the Flash Fiction Z series. The first story from Toy Train is called Toy Train. The boy arrived in the belly of a rumbling train. The girl didn't know him then, knew nothing of what he was to become. Her earliest memories of him are hazy, filtered by the years. She knows the boy was taller than she was, but can't recall the sound of his voice or what colour shoes he had on his feet. But she remembers his hands and what they were like, smooth, like the skin of an egg, always fidgeting. The boy followed his mother onto the platform. The mother wore a lumpy fawn coat and matching hat. The boy was wearing a fire engine red sweater and a 2-kilowatt smile. The boy's mother lifted the girl into the air as she squealed, delighted. "Oh my," the woman said. "Look at your pretty blue dress." The girl flew up above the platform, above the suitcases, above her own mother, above her father, above the little boy who couldn't keep his hands still, even though they both had things in them. The woman lifted the girl onto her shoulders and the hat slipped, almost fell. "And sandals to match." The woman smelled of Parma violets and something else the girl couldn't name. Squeezing the woman's forearm like plasticine, the little girl watched the boy's mud-brown hair bounce on his head as he skipped on the spot. He held a small bag in one hand. In the other, he had a toy train. He grasped the train hard with his pudgy fingers, as if the life would run out of him if he let go. The boy turned to look at his father organising luggage on a trolley. Every so often he'd look at the girl, a grin exploding across his young face. Then he would twist away again. He kicked at an empty cigarette packet while he waited for his father to finish. The girl was too shy to say hello. She couldn't talk to him, but she was curious to know what his hands felt like. The plain sausage of his fingers, the grubby rims of his nails. She wanted to turn the wheels of the toy train engine. The rest of the day is a blur, but she remembers everything that happened between them later, much later. Time passes slower when you're flying on the shoulders of a woman in a fawn coat, so perhaps it wasn't much later at all. The photographs from those days show Grandpa with hair on his head. The girl's brother is only a baby. The boy's father was an old friend of her parents. She hadn't yet started school when the boy's family moved to the area. She envied him. He'd be going to school in the valley, where they had twin swings and a seesaw. The families shared Christmases, birthdays, and picnics in the sun. They drove to the beach together in a rented camper van. They went to each other's houses for dinners and television sport. They shared jokes and tears, goals and fears. They told stories about the old days. The fathers lent each other tools. The mothers shared advice on dressmaking and knitting. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried together. The girl shared her toys with the boy, but there were some things they didn't share. The boy liked the colour red. She was blue. Everything about her was blue. Blue was a slower colour than red. Sometimes it was hard to get away when you were blue, but that never stopped her from trying. The boy reminded her of an insect in many ways, not the woodlice that lurked under stray bricks in her back garden, not the butterflies with parachute wings that floated upwards to freedom, not the beetles that shone as if they'd been burnished with black shoe polish. He reminded her of one of those long-legged, nondescript creatures with no name that was swept away with the rubbish. His legs were longer than hers, the legs he would use to kick her with. His knees were skinned like stained parchment, the knees he would press down onto her chest when they were fighting. The boy liked to fight a lot. He said she needed to learn. His knuckles paled when he curled his hands into fists. He taught her to keep her thumb on the outside when they were boxing. He taught her different rules when they wrestled. Years passed. They played different games, snakes and ladders, doctors and nurses, mummies and daddies. She mixed dirt and water in her sandcastle bucket. They painted their cheeks and knees with mud. They ran to the park, careful to avoid cars and strangers, though sometimes they fought with the chromosome boys, as she came to call them when she was older. When she was older, things changed. The boy did things she didn't understand. The violence was normal because everyone was violent back then. It was their way of speaking. But the weapons he chose were sharper and harder to understand. His mother knitted him new red sweaters whenever he grew. She was always knitting. He was always fighting. When they fought, he told the girl she was a worthy opponent, but she shouldn't make anything of their games. They were just a bit of fun. She liked it best when he went away. When she was older still, she saw less of him. When she was old enough to make her own choices, she made sure she hardly ever saw him. What became of the sandcastle bucket? What became of his toy train? All gone, all forgotten. Memories from so long ago are hazy, but there are things she remembers very clearly. Impossible to forget things. This one's called War Comics. He missed the old place. They'd been in the new house a year. He hated the stained brown carpet, the worn-out way his mother's voice woke him before the alarm clock's screech, how he had to dress himself in the mornings when the bed that had been a frozen pond the night before was too warm to leave. He missed his friends. His father took him to school in the valley and then drove to a point far into the future, somewhere he wouldn't come back from until after the boy had the tongue torn from his mouth for the shape of his accent. He missed G.I. Joe and maritime adventures that took him to another dimension. He couldn't feel sea spray on his shoulders anymore, could barely hear guns strafing left and right. He missed the sound of bombs, their hollow laughter. His mother had thrown his Commando comics away when they moved. Said they couldn't bring everything, and besides, wasn't he a little old for them now? He'd wanted to keep his comics, though they were tattered and torn and seeped in shame. He missed the old place and everyone who stepped in and out of his life. He missed Uncle Robert. They would walk in summer rain. They'd step between railway sleepers. Bubblegum gobstoppers and tank tops, the smell of air-fixed cement that stayed on his fingers for days. He'd be delirious with fear that a train might creep up on them and send them into oblivion. But Uncle Robert said there hadn't been a train in those parts since the days of steam, and that was a long time ago. It was a delicious fear all the same. He never had to spend his own pennies at the shop, and afterwards he'd shake drips from his hair as if he were a lion with a mane. He'd uncurl the new comic from its bag, hold the ink smell to his nose. He missed how he'd climb onto the bed that was as high as a table, myriad comics strewn across the candlewick bedspread, postage stamps of colour against a pale cream backdrop. That's when he learned to walk his eyes around the curls and lines of letters, to make words, understood how they held a story. That's when he learned to hold things perhaps he shouldn't have. He missed Sergeant Fury. He missed the rattle of marbles in the tin. When he went to sleep at the old place, the dream of a gun over his shoulder, he'd long for the next episode of each story. Yet when he'd asked to go home again, his mother had said, "That man's too old to be reading children's comics." In the morning, he'd look through a circular window at the butterfly dawn. He stowed away the silver memories and faced the running river realization that things could never be the same once they left that place. The final story is The Wasp. It wasn't supposed to be like that. School wasn't supposed to be frightening. She'd waited so long counting paper dolls in classroom windows. 1, 2, 7, 6, following the big children to the door until they couldn't be followed anymore. It wasn't supposed to be like that. Perhaps she was in the wrong place. Maybe the school in the valley would have been safer, brighter, but maybe it would smell a little less like dying. Perhaps she was in the wrong life. Other dangers lurked in other places, other schools. Yet wasn't there trouble enough in hers? What did she have to fear? Tick-tock telling off, the scuffle of angry heels on stone floors, back-slap rulers, and blame-ridden fingers. There were so many things to hide from. 1, 2, 500. It wasn't supposed to be like that. The wasp was dead. But whether it was dead or alive didn't matter. The boy who put the wasp in her hair had strangely angular ears, as if someone had folded them and stuck them in place with glue. He had hair the colour of noodles. He reminded her of another boy, one with mud-brown hair, whose cruelty wasn't so easily seen, but stung as deeply. But that boy's dirty fingers lay elsewhere. That boy was in school, in the valley. This boy with his taunts, jibes, and dead insects was what she had to deal with first. It wasn't supposed to be that way, but that's the way it was. Years later, she crawls out the wilderness of her garden, secateurs in hand, and brushes a dead insect from her hair. Over a cup of tea, she daydreams about him, about the boy with noodle-pale hair who wanted to hear her scream. In the dreams, he dies a fantasy death, stung by 100 wasps. They sting him on the tips of things, the tip of his nose, the tip of those pointed ears, the tips of his fingers, their angry buzz satisfying and healing. Years later, she must find suitable punishment in her dreams for another boy. The boy from the valley with mud-brown hair deserves a different death. The boy who became a man who could change destinies, changed her destiny. Perhaps his fantasy death comes with knives, perhaps with poison. Perhaps death will come by his own hand. His hands were always moving. It wasn't supposed to be like that, but she kept counting, seeing faces reflected in the classroom window. 1, 2, 3, 4, until she knew all their names and learned how to count them properly. But by then, she was already gone. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, not Ghosh. That was beautiful. Our second reader is Sandra Arnold. And Sandra Arnold is an award-winning author of 5 books, including 3 novels, a nonfiction book, and a collection of flash fiction. Her latest novel, The Ash, the Well, and the Bluebell, was published by Mcquillen Press in New Zealand in 2019, and her first flash fiction collection, Soul Etchings, was published by Retreat West Books in the UK, also in 2019. She has a PhD in creative writing, and her short stories in flash fiction have been widely published and anthologized in New Zealand and internationally. She was a judge of New Zealand's 2020 National Flash Fiction Day. She has been awarded a Robert Lord Cottage Writing Residency at Dunedin in August-September to complete her second book of flash fiction titled Below Ground. Ladies and gentlemen, Sandra Arnold.
Thank you, Francine. I'm reading 2 stories today from Soul Etchings. Both stories are connected. The first one is called The Patchwork Quilt. No, sorry, that's the second one. The first one is a real live one. When Mrs. Berryman came to get her hair permed by Jenny's mum, she asked Jenny if it was okay to put her baby in the doll's cot. Jenny nodded and took her doll Patsy out of the cot and watched Mrs. Berryman tuck the baby inside. "Oh, he looks just like a doll himself, doesn't he, Jenny?" her mum said. Jenny looked at Patsy. She didn't think Patsy looked anything like baby Berryman. Patsy's head was covered with blonde curls. Her eyes clicked open and shut. Her eyebrows were painted on, and her body was cold and stiff. When you turned her over, she said, "Ma, ma." The baby's head was covered in fuzz like a new chicken, and he breathed and made tiny snuffling sounds. Jenny touched his soft cheek. Mrs. Berryman and Jenny's mum smiled at each other, and Mrs. Berryman said, "Ah, you'd like one like that, wouldn't you, Jenny?" And she turned to Jenny's mum and said, "You'll have to get busy." And they both laughed. And Jenny's mum said, "One's enough, thank you very much." Jenny wondered what was so funny. Baby Berryman began to cry, and Jenny watched open-mouthed as Mrs. Berryman lifted him onto her knee, unbuttoned her blouse, and put her titty in his mouth. Mum explained that this was nature's way of feeding a baby. Jenny asked if Mum had fed her like that, and Mum said, yes, of course, that's what titties were for. When Mrs. Berryman went home, Jenny touched the place in the cot where the baby had slept. It was warm and smelt of talcum powder. She lifted Patsy off the floor and held her to her titty, made the sucking sound she'd heard the baby make. Jenny's mother laughed and said one day Jenny would have a real live one of her own. The night after Mrs. Berryman's visit, Jenny dreamed that Patsy was alive, that she was crying. Even though it was still dark, she got up and tiptoed across the landing, down the stairs, and into the living room to her cot. She touched Patsy's cheek. It was cold and hard and stiff. She shivered. Jenny's best friend Wendy came over to play, bringing her dolls and her mother's shopping bag. 2 dolls were walkie-talkies and had 3 changes of clothes each. One was a replica of a newborn baby with a screwed-up face. The girls undressed the dolls, bathed them in a dish of soapy water, dressed them again, and Jenny showed Wendy how to feed them, like Mrs. Berryman did. She told Wendy about baby Berryman's soft skin, his warmth, his bendy legs, his snuffly sounds. Better than a doll, Jenny said, looking at the newborn doll, lying blank-faced and silent on the floor. She asked her mum if they could borrow baby Berryman to play with. Her mum laughed and said no, she didn't think so. And why didn't the girls take their dolls to the park and get some fresh air? On their way to the park, Wendy said she had an idea, but first they'd need to go to her house. Her mum was at work, she said, but Wendy had a key. In her pink and white bedroom, with the matching quilts and curtains, and the Victorian doll's house, and the Silver Cross doll's pram that Jenny wished with all her heart she could have for Christmas, but which her mum said was too expensive. Wendy opened the bag and tossed the dolls on her bed and told Jenny her idea. Jenny shivered with the thrill of it. At the shopping centre, they saw a woman parking a pram. They watched her checking the baby before she slipped into the bank. A few people were walking down the street looking in shop windows. A couple of cyclists pedalled furiously, trying to beat the lights. The girls were quick. The baby was in the shopping bag before the lights turned red. In Wendy's bedroom, the girls peeled the patchwork quilt from the baby and laid it on the floor. They stroked its soft hair and tiny toes and fingers. Jenny showed Wendy how to hold its head up, the way she'd seen Mrs. Berryman do it. They played princesses who needed to hide from the wicked king who'd captured their father and killed their little brothers. They arranged the dolls upside down on the floor and cried over their dead bodies. The baby started whimpering, so Jenny lifted her t-shirt and held the baby to her titty. To her surprise, she heard no guzzling noises, and the baby started crying louder. She put it back on the floor and it screwed its face up and turned red and beat the air with its little fists. Wendy's eyes widened. She put her hand over the baby's mouth to stop the noise. Jenny pulled Wendy's hand off the baby's face. "We'd better take it back," she said, wrapping the baby in the quilt. When she put it in the bag and closed the zip, it stopped crying. The girls retraced their steps to the bank. The pram had gone. In its place, two grim-faced policemen were talking to people and writing in notepads. Jenny started crying. "They should hand the baby over to the policeman," she said, and explained they just borrowed it. "Don't be stupid," said Wendy. The park was full of children playing and mothers pushing prams and people throwing balls for their dogs. The girls walked around the edge until they found a quiet corner behind the trees. They hid the bag in a bush. As they walked away, Jenny began to sob. They ran out of the park without looking back. And the second story is called The Patchwork Quilt. When Marianne found she was pregnant at the age of 45, she took her grandmother's quilting bag out of its box in the attic. She brought out her own bag of scraps that she'd saved from her favourite childhood dresses, teenage ball gowns, material she'd sewn into clothes and cushions from bazaars in India, the Middle East, and markets in Africa and Europe. Each piece contained a story. She spread all the pieces on the floor and cut them into small squares. Then, with her grandmother's needles, she began to sew a patchwork quilt. Every evening through spring, summer, and autumn, she sat sewing in her grandmother's leather chair and told her unborn child the stories. She was standing at Grandpa's knee with her two brothers, begging him to take his eye out. Grandpa bent his head, and with a deft twist of his wrist, out popped the eye. It lay in his open palm and goggled at the three children while they gasped and persuaded him to talk of fighting in the trenches and the Germans shooting him in the eye and going to hospital, and the doctor saving one eye and putting a glass one in the empty socket, and the nurse writing his letters to Grandma for him and putting sloppy bits in that he would never have thought of. With her brothers, Marianne sat on the rag rug and sucked on the sweets Grandpa shared with them from the stash given to him each day by the school children he shepherded across the road with his red stop sign. "Don't tell Grandma, or she'll say I'm ruining your teeth." Then he loosened his dentures and clattered them in his jaw, and Marianne and her brothers fell around laughing, and toffee juice spilt on her blue gingham dress. With tiny stitches, Marianne sewed the blue gingham square next to a darker blue that had been in the pocket of the apron Grandma wore when she sewed, her needle flashing in and out of the squares while she told Marianne their stories. Green velvet from the dress some travelling actors had given her when she was 17, and which she'd worn to meet Grandpa in secret because he was a Catholic. Lilac silk from her wedding that all his relatives had boycotted because she wasn't Catholic. White satin from the christening robe of her babies, including the 3 who died. Marianne added purple corduroy from the dungarees she'd worn to collect eggs and afterwards sit in the sun with the hens pecking the earth and no sound but the breeze and the hens breathing, and Grandma saying that ancient Egyptians, Eskimos, Aztecs and Indians believed wind, breath and spirit were the same thing. Listening to a creature breathing, she said, was how you connected with its soul. Marianne asked her how she knew, and she said Marianne would find out for herself one day. As autumn slid into winter, Marianne sewed the final patch from the red dress she'd worn to Grandma's funeral because she'd promised Grandma she wouldn't wear black. With all the stories stitched in place, the quilt was ready. When she brought Chloe home from the hospital, she laid her in the cot and wrapped her in the quilt. "These stories are in your blood and bones," she said. "They'll sustain you until you're ready to add your own." For Chloe's first outing, Marianne wrapped her in the quilt and tucked her in the pram. Outside the bank, she wondered if she should take the pram inside, but the bank was small and there was no room to maneuver. So she pulled on the brake, checked that Chloe was asleep, darted in the doorway, cashed her check and hurried out. In the pale light of early winter, shoppers scuttled past, huddled against the cold, their breath forming clouds on the frozen air. Cyclists swathed in scarves dodged around cars. Music drifted from a nearby cafe with aromas of steaming coffee. Marianne reached out her hand to check the baby. Her hand touched empty space. She pulled the pram cover back, the merino blankets, and patted her hand down the mattress as if Chloe might somehow be hidden there. Then she opened her mouth to call for help, but no sound came out. The following hours were consumed by police, phone calls, visitors bringing food and flowers. Her brothers, her friends, and her neighbours joined in the search. Marianne lay on the couch trying to breathe. No one had seen a person walking away from the bank with a baby. The police searched hospital records for women who'd recently given birth, whose babies had died. It was very common in such circumstances, they said, that women went insane with grief. They would put an appeal on television. They would ask people to come forward if they knew of a relative or a neighbour who'd suddenly appeared with a newborn. Early next morning, a man walking his dog in the park heard a mewling. He thought it was an abandoned kitten until he looked behind a bush and saw a shopping bag with a baby inside wrapped in a quilt. The baby was dehydrated, the doctor said. She'd been lying in the park all night. Luckily, the quilt had kept her alive, but only just. Because of the tubes attached to Chloe, Marianne couldn't hold her. So she tucked the quilt around her body and told her the new story of two young girls who'd stolen a baby and panicked and left her alone in a park. When she finished the story, she listened to Chloe breathing, matched the rhythm with her own breath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was wonderful, Sandra Arnold. Really, really wonderful reading. Thank you so much for being here and for reading with us tonight. Next up is Michelle Elvy. Michelle Elvy is a writer, editor, and manuscript assessor based in Dunedin. Her first online project was 2010's 52250, A Year of Flash, which I remember very well from way back when. In 2012, she founded Flash Frontier, an adventure in short fiction, and New Zealand's National Flash Fiction Day. She has been an assistant editor for Best Small Fiction since the series began in 2015. Her anthology work is extensive, including 2018's Bonsai Best Small Stories of Aotearoa, New Zealand, this year's Ko Aotearoa Tatu, We Are New Zealand, a collection of voices gathered after the Christchurch mosque shootings last year, and a new project launched yesterday, August 1st, 2020 in New Zealand, Love in the Time of COVID, a chronicle of a pandemic, which she is curating with Witte Emira. And you can find that online and submit, Michelle says, Love in the Time of COVID Chronicle.com. Michelle's 2019 book, The Ever Rumble, Ad Hoc Fiction 2019, is a small novel in small forms. Welcome, Michelle Elvy.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Meg and Francine, for having me here. It's wonderful to be reading with Nod and Sandra, two writers in New Zealand whose work I admire very much. And I've worked with both of them in various platforms, so it's really great to be here. Thank you. I'm going to read some things that are actually much shorter, so maybe it gives a slightly different flavor and adds to this discussion, which I think we're having afterwards. The first piece I'm going to read just one piece from my book, The Ever Rumble, which is this. I'll just share it there. So I'm going to read this one piece, which is from a series of dreamscapes, and this is the first one, called Whale Shark and Boy. She dreamed she was a whale shark, dreaming she was a boy, dreaming he was a whale shark, dreaming she was a boy, dreaming he was a whale shark, dreaming she was a boy. Illuminating, diving, soaring, all in one night, or maybe it was 1 hour or even 1 minute. She dove down, down, and down, and found fluorescent charms swinging from the snouts of seahorses. She flew firecracker fast, fearsome and jubilant at the dizzying depths and iridescent shape of things. She fed on plankton, but they weren't plankton at all. They were morsels of delight, merry magical minstrels skipping on her tongue, pressing and lifting at the same time. Between bites, gapes, because there's no chewing when you're a whale shark. She napped and dreamed, and she was the boy, and she had a ladder, and she climbed and climbed and climbed. The ladder went up to the top of her house and beyond. It touched treetops and the salt of the sea sky in the harbor. It exceeded the reach of her mother's call, way out in the ever dark of the night. She dove through silk raindrops, and she was a whale shark again, pectoral fin, browsing slippery sand. And then she was boy again, shifting back and forth, down and up, tail swish, long and smooth and elegant like a shark, but not a shark. Then boy with hands, digging a moat of water for protection, naturally, around a castle, singing sea lavender songs. As a whale shark, she dreamed the boy. And as the boy, she dreamed the whale shark. And so on. Blue-black of ocean to black-blue of sky. Down and back up, swimming, laddering, lunging, climbing. She can be anything in her dreams. She opens her mouth and swallows the stars. And that's from the Ever Rumble. So the next two pieces are from, for some reason, I also notice now these themes, lots of wind and sea in my writing. And the next piece is from a series that I'm working on right now that is very much coming off of my experience of living on a sailboat and being out and about in the oceans. So that's, yeah, something I'm working on now. And some of the pieces are drawn from earlier work and some are brand new. So this is from a series called Moments in Sand. Excuse me. And this is Moments in Sand 1, Delaware, 1979. And it's from personal experiences, but creative nonfiction, I suppose. My brother leaps off the end of the jetty. Sand flings from his feet. He's airborne a second or two, feels like forever, and I think he'll keep going, fly away. Origami boy, sudden swan, limbs tucked, then released, gangly and long. He unfolds, stretches, becomes elegant, blonde mane whipping, wings out wide. Jet fast now, there's no stopping him, and he's gone. And then the last piece I'm going to read is called Three Houses. And actually, I wrote the original version of this piece back in that 52 to 50 project 10 years ago in 2010. So it's sort of fun. And I've looked at a lot of those pieces and they sort of are fitting into this new thing I'm working on because I hadn't really ever done a lot with them, but I did write them that year. So this is called Three Houses. The first house I built was in the early 90s. Pre-internet software engineering firm, boom, went our stocks. Father tisked his tongue, muttered things like House of Cards and Icarus. But I was pig-headed, grew the company fast, invested in shiny black Next cubes, played Doom till 5 a.m. with Marty and Jeff. I secured bank loans and spoke at California conferences with Steve Jobs, got a sprawling cherry desk with a view of Boston's harbor. Then a cold wind blew in, puffed and puffed, and kaboom went our stocks. The next house I built was in 1999, a bona fide urban walk-up love nest. Stan and I moved in together within 3 months of meeting. Mother tisked her tongue, called it a house of fire, but I was pig-headed and didn't listen, and Stan was hot. Neighbors carrying groceries smiled at me in the stairwell. We drank wine and played chess at night, made love till dawn. Then a cold northerly blew in. Her name was Ilsa. She huffed and puffed till he moved out. I licked my burnt ass and didn't call my mother for a month. Then I built my third house. Both parents tisked their tongues, said very little. It's smaller than the others, more modest than the first, more secure than the second, and it can stand up to the wind. So when the cold northerly huffed and puffed this time, I hoisted my sails and flew. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle Elvy. And Michelle, thank you, Nagash, Sandra Arnold, and Michelle Elvy. And if we can all unmute, I think we all have. And Meg, if you could put us on gallery view. Okay. So I'm just curious because I think that, you know, living outside, far outside of New Zealand, being in the US, I really get the perception that there's quite a lively and thriving scene of flash fiction in New Zealand. One of the reasons I get this impression is that I happened to see the Flash Fiction Day that you produced, Michelle. I saw it on YouTube and I was just blown away by that. I told Sandra that. I was just so impressed with all the really good stuff dispersed with the music. And if that is still on YouTube, I'll put the link in the comments so that people can see that, because it was really wonderful. A lot of wonderful readers. But so anyway, I was just wondering, and you know, any of you can address this. Why is flash fiction so popular in New Zealand? What do you think is causing that?
I've often wondered. I've often wondered if it's a case of perception. It's so hard to measure these things, and I'm also very aware that my viewpoint is limited by the English language and by the circles I frequent through the social media that I'm in. But I've personally felt that my access to different types of flash has grown massively over the years. And we're very lucky to have Michelle on this discussion, because I have to say that none of this would have been as accessible to me personally if it wasn't for the National Flash Fiction Day New Zealand and for Flash Frontier. And also, I think we'd had the possibility that Frankie Mcquillen might have been joining us at one stage. Now, Frankie is a wonderful flash fiction writer, and also because she teaches at the Hagley Writers Institute in Christchurch, and has spread the word of flash there. I think we've spawned a lot of good writers who
tried to get Frankie to be with us, yeah, and we're going to have her real soon because we absolutely adore her work. Yeah, we're huge fans.
So if you measure it in terms of the shortlisted and long-listed writers in international competitions, I do see a high representation of New Zealand writers. So. I think it kind of answers the why in one perspective.
Yeah. And I think in New Zealand, my experience working with a lot of different writers around the country is that first of all, there's a very strong tradition of poetry in New Zealand, and it's something that goes very far back in our writing roots, and storytelling as well. And the storytelling coming up from the Maori traditions, and the poetry coming up from European traditions. And I feel like with both of those things, there's kind of that sense of the rhythmic, poetic telling of stories that's somehow a piece of New Zealand. And that's only my own view, and I come at it as an immigrant from the outside. But I know that when I read very short stories or poetry, I get a sense that there's kind of a blending of boundaries, that there's an opening up. And I really like that. And I think that's what's allowed for a lot of flash fiction to take on so well in New Zealand. And actually, Frankie is a really good example to bring up. It's wonderful to hear she's going to be with you later in the series. Because Frankie also, I think, she can correct me if I'm wrong, but she is a poet, and she might have started out as a poet. I think her first book was a book of poetry. Yeah. So Frankie was originally a poet and has moved into flash fiction from poetry. Certainly that knowledge and that influence and that sense of rhythm and poetic sense, if you read Frank Mcquillen's pieces and other writers in New Zealand, a lot of them you can tell there's a real poetic sense. So in that book, Bonsai, for example, you will find a lot of pieces where that line is blurred. Is it prose poetry? Yeah. Is it short story flash fiction? It's not always clear, but I, for one, really like that. So
me too, that Frankie's the perfect example of that kind of thing.
Really good example.
Really, yeah.
So I'll hand it over to Sandra. She probably has things to say because she just judged the national competition, and there's also that there.
Yeah, I think you've covered a lot of those points about why it's so popular here, but I hadn't heard of flash fiction before 2016, interestingly. And I only heard about it because I was talking to a friend who is a poet, Jim Norcliffe, who's also very involved in the flash scene here and in Flash Frontier. He's an editor for Flash Frontier. I think because my focus is on novel writing and occasionally short stories, but I asked him about flash, and he said his definition was it was like prose poetry, but with a narrative arc. And I said, I don't see how you can possibly get a whole story in, 250 or 300 words. And I think he said something like, read Flash Frontier, and you'll find stories that will cover not just a moment, but a whole lifetime, because the significant parts are what is not actually stated. The gaps are more important, or just as important as what is stated. So I read Flash Frontier, and was not expecting to be blown away by it, but really and truly was, because of the quality of the writing. People like Helen Mcquillen, for example, Gail Ingram, amazing flash fiction writers, and almost everything that I read of theirs, I love. So that's what started me writing it. And at that point, I think having a conversation with Frankie Mcquillen too, she pointed me in the direction of overseas flash magazines, and I discovered there was a whole world of flash
We
out there.
published your work, Sandra, in New Flash Fiction Review. I think it would have been 2016 or so, pretty early.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That must have been around that time that you started.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And I find that it's, to answer the question really about why it's so common in New Zealand, or why it's so popular in New Zealand, I think probably before Flash Frontier got started, there wasn't much going. Is that right, Michelle? Or you can probably answer that better than I can. It was mostly in the odd poetry book, perhaps, a little bit of Flash, maybe in the guise of prose poetry rather than being called Flash. So I think that magazine was instrumental in the Flash form becoming so popular here.
It really was a Flash frontier. For New Zealand, yes. It was literally. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fun that you both mentioned that, because we did have that in mind when we started it and we came up with the title. We thought, well, let's open this up. Let's open up this territory and see what happens. And I mean, this journal began with very modest goals. I was working with a colleague in Northland, and we started out just as a Northland journal. We thought, well, let's try some flash fiction and see how it takes. And after the first issue, we had submissions coming in from all over the country. So for the first year, it was a New Zealand journal, and then very quickly we made it international. And I wanted to say that as well. I think it's really interesting to think about the different kinds of writing that happen regionally, because of course, I think one of the things that New Zealand writers have benefited from tremendously, and I can say this for myself as well, because I really like crossing those geographic boundaries as well. And that's the connection to other writers all over the world. I mean, flash fiction is one of those forms, I think, that can change very quickly. And it does, depending on the voices that you are hearing. So that's why the international anthologies that we see, whether it's Best Small Fiction, Best Microfiction, the Flash Fiction International that came out from Norton a few years back. Right. They're wonderful because they're these gatherings of international voices. And then you see region to region, place to place, language to language, how the form is different. And I feel like definitely for New Zealand, which we're always aware we're an island nation, looking outside of our boundaries is kind of part of who we are, I think. So, and I don't know if Nod and Sandra agree with that, but I find that really interesting, paying attention to not just our voices, but the other voices and how these all connect and influence each other. I don't know, Nod, Sandra?
I think very much so, because it's been kind of like a training ground for me, reading all the mainly online international publications and learning the nuances of the form.
I mean, are there places that, I was thinking that too, are there places to take courses in Flash there? I mean, there really isn't much here in the US. And I mean, it's still very new here, so, but there are courses you could go to. I mean, not online so much, but.
Yeah. Well, Nod already mentioned the Hagley Writers Institute, which is in Christchurch, and they do a wonderful job. And I think they might be the first place that actually has offered courses in flash fiction. Is that right, Nod? I think that might be true.
No, whether they specifically do courses in flash fiction, but certainly it's introduced very early and it's encouraged, and the students are encouraged to go and perform their flash and read in public, etc. So with having Frankie there as a key person, it's definitely...
And besides that, what's really interesting... Oh, sorry, Nod. I thought you had finished. Go on.
That's cool.
Zoom is always funny that way. Besides Hagley, which I'm really glad Nod has mentioned, and of course needs to be mentioned here, I think we're seeing this in New Zealand as well as other places, and you'll be able to tell us whether it's true in the UK and in the United States, but more and more Flash is being considered as part of you know, a genre that should be taken seriously and written about. So people are writing master's theses around the form, and we're seeing that more and more. So Heather Mcquillen, who was mentioned by Sandra, she wrote her master's thesis around flash fiction. It was both a study of the form and then her own work. In the second part of it, it was a collection of her own work, and that whole thing together worked as her master's. And there are lots of other people doing that. So universities here are opening more and more to the idea. And we know that flash fiction lends itself so well to teaching. So we all teach it as well. I mean, I teach it, and I use it actually even to work with novelists as an editor and as a manuscript assessor. And in my class that I'm teaching online, there are novelists, there are poets, there are memoirists. So flash fiction is such a fantastic tool for teaching, honing in on the writing. And I know Pamela Painter, you know Pam, Meg. Pamela Painter also, she's been teaching it for years.
Yeah, she was
you
one
can
of
probably speak to that, Meg.
She was one of the first to teach it in the United States. And from what I hear, I've never actually taken one of her classes, one of the very best, one of the most innovative teachers. But yeah, absolutely. And I think she's been teaching it for, would you say, I mean, I'm just guessing, but maybe 15 years, you know, before anyone else, I think. But I shouldn't be quoted on that because I'm not sure how long. But yeah.
Are there venues to go and read flash? I don't know how opened up New Zealand is. You know, I mean, sounds like you guys have COVID under control there. So are things opening up? Like, can you go to clubs and do they have flash fiction or poetry readings?
I think poetry is probably there is a poetry society here. And there are poetry readings which occasionally will introduce some flash fiction writers as well. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't a specific club for flash writers. Have you heard of anything, Nod or Michelle?
Well, not a specific regular club, but there is an overlap, as you say, with poetry, but also, Michelle, you mentioned storytelling. There's something in Christchurch called Natural Born Storytellers, and a lot of the flash fiction community there appear there and not read because it's about telling stories without paper, but would certainly bring in some of the disciplines that they've learned from the form in terms of how concise their storytelling is. And also there was the best small fictions reading at our Turanga Library in Christchurch that Michelle, you were a presenter there. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think Nod's right. There are other opportunities all over the country where people are, the organizers invite people across genres. So it's not so much that there's a reading only for poetry, or, I mean, there might be those, but there are often readings where a lot of different kinds of people are invited in. So in Auckland, there's a series called the Lounge Series, and it's through the university, and it has run for many, many years, and of course was shut down during COVID, and it's just starting up again. And I noticed that in the first lineup, there are a lot of poets, but one of the readers is Ramiel Cottrell, and he's somebody he's working on his degree at Auckland University, and he's writing new flash fiction. I would say he's fairly new to the form, maybe in the last couple of years, and he's just a marvelous writer. He's got a real knack for it. He just won the Flash Frontier Winter Writing Award. And he was shortlisted. He was a finalist for the Sir Julius Vogel Award, which is in science fiction, speculative fiction. So he's somebody who's very much, I would say he's not a poet, he's a storyteller, but he's showing up at this reading with poets, with novelists. It's an opportunity for people who are working on new things to present their work. And there's something called the Wire Wrap a Word. That's also something that's a series that they bring in people from all over, and that's closer to Wellington. So around the country, you will find lots of different kinds of readings. In Dunedin, where I live, in a little bit south of Christchurch, there's a poetry collective, And all kinds of readers show up to that as well. And there are different opportunities for readers along the way. So I think it's a pretty active country in terms of being friendly and welcoming in terms of the readings that are offered.
It's
That's
nice
my
too that it's not just Flash, that it's like combined with other forms. I think that's really nice. It has a nice feeling to it.
So just to close up, is there anything that you'd like to see happen with Flash more in New Zealand that maybe hasn't been happening yet, or like more readings, more opportunities, things like that?
I think it would be good to see more mainstream publishers publishing Flash.
Yeah.
At the moment, as far as I'm aware, Canterbury University Press is the only one that's done that. They published Frankie Mcquillen's 2 books of Flash. But as far as I'm aware, none of the other ones have. And that would be really good to see that opening up a little bit more.
Great. And okay, I want to thank our readers, Ghosh, Sandra Arnold, and Michelle Elvy for this really wonderful discussion and great readings, flash fiction, and of course Meg Pokrass, my co-host, and you, our viewers. We love and appreciate you. So we will see you soon on Flash Fiction Z. Night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, thanks. Good night.
Thank you.